Good evening. My name is Roberta Phillips. I'm the CEO for the Prince George's County Memorial Library System in Maryland. On behalf of the library and Prince George's County Human Relations Commission, welcome to tonight's program, which is part of our Voting, Democracy, and Action series, focused on election engagement education. Interpreting MLK Jr.'s Legacy and Ending Voter Suppression features distinguished civil rights leaders, educators, organizers, and communicators whose work is respected nationally. This is supported in part by the Maryland Humanities and launches the Voices and Votes Electoral Engagement Project, made possible by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation's Why It Matters Civic and Electoral Participation initiative. And now I'd like to introduce our special guests. First, we have Andrew Aydin. He is a New York Times bestselling author, a National Book Award winner, a Walter Dean Myers Award winner, and the recipient of multiple Coretta Scott King Awards. He is the creator and co-author of the graphic memoir series, March, which chronicles the life of Congressman and civil rights icon John Lewis. Co-authored with Representative Lewis and illustrated by Nate Powell, March is the first comics work to ever win the National Book Award. An Atlanta native, Andrew is a Turkish American who was raised by a single mother and grew up reading comic books. After college, he took a job with Congressman Lewis and served as his digital director and policy advisor. Andrew's other works include the Captain America story, Home of the Brave, and Marvel Comics Presents #3 for Marvel Comics. Our next guest is Andrea Blackman, and she has coordinated Nashville Public Library's nationally recognized civil rights room and collection after years of teaching and consulting in both Florida and Tennessee. She also serves as the Special Collections Division Manager at Nashville Public. During her tenure, she has led 10 successful oral history projects and managed the expansion of the library's public programming. She serves on the board of directors for the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition and the Tennessee Historical Records Advisory Board. She is a 2018 Library Journal Mover and Shaker. Our next guest is Taos Wynn, an Atlanta-based humanitarian, order, and advocate for social progress and peace. He is recognized for his commitment to empowering communities domestically and abroad. Taos currently serves as the Chief Executive Officer at Perfect Love Foundation, which I think is the best name ever, a nonprofit organization he founded in 2013 with a focus on 3 areas: community, education, and advocacy in Atlanta. He has recently joined the historic Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change to spearhead the center's nonviolent education and training efforts. Taos has been recognized for his public service on national, state, and local levels. In April 2018, the Office of Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms awarded Taos the Phoenix Award for his leadership, advocacy, and philanthropic efforts. He has also received the Outstanding Georgia Citizen Award and Daily Point of Light Award for his contributions and volunteer service to the greater Atlanta community. Welcome. Tonight's event will be moderated by Renee Battle Brooks, our very own Executive Director of the Prince George's County Human Relations Commission, and my proud colleague, Nicholas Brown, the library COO for Communication and Outreach. The panel will take audience questions toward the end of the program, and I also encourage you to share the event link on your social media and tag at PGCMLS and at HRCPG County on your posts. Please enjoy the program, and thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Andrew, Andrea, Taos, and Renee for joining the Library and Human Relations Commission tonight. We are so honored to have all of you here with us, given your important leadership at the national level. And we are living through crazy dark times in which the topics we're going to discuss tonight are really relevant on an hour-by-hour basis to what's unfolding everywhere in the country right now, and even with our allies outside the country. So the hope for tonight is really to cover both Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy and then also the lessons that we carry forward in the work that is doesn't need to be viewed as partisan, but should be viewed from a human rights perspective and community building, which applies to all of us here as we try and seek a better future, which is kind of, unfortunately, the permanent state of being. But in many ways, it's important to be realistic about that. Turn things over to Renee to get us started here, and I appreciate your joining us, Renee, to moderate.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you all for coming. So I always think it's important for any discussion to bring along those that may not have the same foundation that others have. And so I first wanted to ask, from each of your perspectives, what is voter suppression, and how do you see it playing out in your space where you work? And anybody, yeah, It's a conversation.
Well, I'll start. I think that voter suppression, at least in my world, is really taking the initiative to stifle one's ability to participate in the democratic process, taking certain measures or implementing certain tactics, strategies that really pose as challenges or make it difficult for one to exercise their democratic right to vote. Typically, those forms of suppression are based on rooted oppression, whether that's racism or sexism or any of the other isms that you would like or care to mention. But typically voter suppression is just that, whatever methodology is employed to really prevent or enable somebody from exercising that right in our space.
Okay, and I'll give a second question before the others answer, not for you to answer now, but to think about, really tying it up with, what would Dr. King think of perhaps some of the examples of voter suppression that are occurring in the here and now, and sort of that juxtaposition? What does it mean? So whoever wants to answer the first question.
Yeah, I'm like dying to, but Andrea, I want to defer to you first. So I want to give you the opportunity to speak, right. And I don't want to.
You don't want to dive in just yet. Okay, so I'll piggyback off, and Teo perfectly gave the best example of what voter suppression is and what it looks like and how we are seeing it manifest. What comes to mind is the immediate removal and purging of records. We very seldom talk about that. We're talking about long lines in certain neighborhoods. We're talking about the lack of precincts in some neighborhoods versus others. But the deliberate purging of records has to be part of that conversation when we're talking about voter suppression and what we are seeing in our region.
Absolutely.
No, I think you guys are all right. I think to put it in the context that you asked about, Renee, in terms of Dr. King's own experiences, many of the voter suppression initiatives that we see today are the exact same thing they faced within SCLC and SNCC and in other parts of the voter registration and voting rights movement. For instance, comfort items. This is one that appalls me to this day. You see in Georgia, you are not allowed to give comfort items, which could be a piece of pizza or a bottle of water, to people waiting in line to vote. That is an exact tactic that they used during the voter registration campaigns during the Mississippi Freedom Summer. That's what they used in Alabama. That's what they used in Georgia in the 1960s. These are tactics that they've used for a generation or more, and they continue to use them today. I think you also face things that are more insidious. It's simple things like moving the polling place before the election. It is, making, we're seeing it right now with the governor of Georgia, and I mean this in no nonpartisan way. This is the same thing that they did during the movement. The governor of Georgia is calling for an increase for a mandated use of ID for absentee voting. That is a form of voter suppression. Because think about it, if you live in a rural area and you have one car that you share in your family, and you need to go get your ID, and that ID costs you $50, and you're working for $7.15 an hour at the minimum wage. Those are all forms of voter suppression. Your driver's license should be free if you are living below the poverty line. Your access to the ballot itself should be mandatory. They should send you a ballot proactively. It's a form of voter suppression to not send those ballots out, to require you to respond to a mailer that, frankly, under the Secretary of State in Georgia, did not look like a voting envelope. It was every form of pernicious non-compliance that they could enact, they did. And back to Andrea's point, in addition, they purged people inappropriately and possibly illegally from the voting rolls. And these are all tactics that were used during the civil rights movement that Dr. King faced. And I can't tell you how frustrating it is to see these same politicians enacting these programs who go to Ebenezer and sat in front of Reverend Warnock and praised Dr. King every Martin Luther King Day. We lost a statesman in Georgia when we lost Johnny Isaacson. And he kept this coalition together in many ways because he was a decent man. I grew up across the street from where he grew up in Atlanta. And I knew him. And losing him in the Georgia delegation has taken the Republicans and taken that party in a direction that I'm not sure they can come back from. And that's not even to get started on what's happening at the national level. The Shelby County decision that struck down the Voting Rights Act in the Shelby County decision in 2013. We need the Voting Rights Advancement Act. We need the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and we need it now.
Yeah. What do you think? What do you think Dr. King's reflections would be if he were dropped literally into this time today? Like, how far we have not come, how far, it's always interesting to me to think about the passage of time and sort of measuring how well we're doing, how well we're not doing, his legacy.
Not to speak about something, I can't imagine what Dr. King would think, but I do know what John Lewis said about what Dr. King would think. And that is that he said, we've come a great distance, but we're not there yet. I mean, what we've seen is unbelievable African-American turnout, flexing a muscle that has been long suppressed. And I think that would be incredibly encouraging, especially when he looks at the amount of young participation, right? I mean, 18 to 24-year-olds amounted to a larger percentage of the runoff population than they've ever been before. And in fact, I think we're starting to approach nationally youth voter participation that may meet or exceed some of the highest turnout numbers we've seen since the passage of the 26th Amendment that allowed 18-year-olds to vote. That's just my take.
What do you think? And sorry, go ahead, Andrea.
No, I would say that the absurdity of thinking that where we are, again, I can't quote what Dr. King would feel, but again, like Andrew, speaking with local civil rights leaders here in Nashville, whether it's, the 3 remaining freedom riders or any of them, the idea of the absurdity that there's this new liberal progress and that we are post anything, I think that would cause him to pause. I think the idea of somehow being more idealistic than looking at, as he coined, these 3 evils and not putting them back on the table and in the conversation, I think would cause him to pause as well.
So each of you have a very kind of important place in this work, right? Andrew, you've worked in policy and you've been a communicator and an advisor and also a creator on the author side. And Taos, you're a leader in community organizing and you train others to do the work. And then Andrea, you kind of are an educator in the library setting where you are really taking everyone where they are and helping them in their journey based on their own profile, whether they're a high school student or a police officer who is pro-riot or something like that. Can you speak a little bit to how you kind of bring in the history in the ways that you communicate about what's happening now so that people can start to understand the greater context of what we're dealing with now and the finite moment that we've really been living in history since the 60s?
I'll take a start. Our curated civil rights center at our public library was designed to do just that, engage communities and moving beyond 1960, beyond Nashville's response to the Brown Board decision. But it was also designed and curated to honor all of these iconic people that we know have come to love and write about. But it also is a place where we can examine our role and our personal responsibility. We try really hard to make the space, which is, there's a replica of a lunch counter that is 10 rules of nonviolence is etched in the lunch counter. Dr. King's quote of what he said about Nashville stands center in the room. And it's the prominent piece, of saying that I didn't come to Nashville to bring inspiration, but to gain inspiration from a movement that has taken place already in this community. So the room and pretty much the work is to remind not only Nashville, but anyone who's visiting in this space, scholar, historian, or documentarian, or fourth grader who's doing a Tennessee history report, that the responsibility is still here. And Nashville was doing and being long before the students sat in 1960. You know, we can think about 1940, we can think about, you know, the Race Relations Institute here at Fisk University. But when we're bringing communities together, we are wanting them to really have this intellectual, stimulating conversation. It's about personal discovery. It's about their opportunity to be agency, to be audience, and to accept and not accept the narratives that we've always been told about a modern civil rights movement. One of the things that we tried so hard to do is to connect our histories to healing, and what is our human response to that healing, and how do we weave past and present and future to not just reflect and honor and pay tribute, but to create a new revolution, and thinking about King's undone revolution.
I was going to say, as it relates to the work at the King Center, we serve as kind of a living memorial to the legacy of Dr. King. And when we talk about history for us, you know, it's important to place context, right? So we use the history not for the purposes of replicating what's been done, but to look at it in context and to see kind of the methodology, the principles and strategies that went into the work that we popularized as the civil rights movement here in America. And so for us, it provides that context, a bit of a roadmap from a principle standpoint, because ultimately the work that was done in the civil rights movement was largely defined by principles. Kingian philosophy, which the King Center has now rebranded more recently under the leadership of Dr. Bernice King, is called Nonviolence 365. And the reason for that is because nonviolence is a lifestyle that can be employed 365 days of the year. And so really what we look to do is to take what the principles were and make those relevant today. So how do those principles still apply? Not only the principles, but then what are the strategies and how do they apply and how do the two intersect? It's hard to distinguish one from the other. And a lot of times we just look at the direct action that was done in the civil rights movement. And a lot of times we use that as a starting point today, in which we start at the point of direct action, whether that's marching or leading a protest. But there was so much that went behind the scenes from a principle standpoint. And before you ever even got the opportunity to march, you had to understand the principles. You had to understand the teachings of nonviolence. And also kind of to dismiss some of the myths that surround nonviolence is another key component of the work that we do. Nonviolence is not passive. Nonviolence is not weak. Nonviolence is not anemic. Nonviolence requires a courageous lifestyle. And so we promote that. We tell people that you have to be willing to do the work. Just a little while ago, you pointed to the fact that, you know, how would Dr. King view the things that are going on in today's society? And even Coretta Scott King made the allusion that progress is fought for in every generation. And it's the responsibility of every generation to continue that fight for progress and justice. And so I think if Dr. King was to look at where we are currently, he would say there's work to do. And we have to do that work, but we have to be committed and make a personal commitment to making sure that the work is done. Doing the actual work is not the glamorous part always. It's not what gets the headlines. It's not what always appears in the news and television. But there's so much groundwork that can be done exercising and using those principles of nonviolence. And so a large part of our work is really conveying that, illustrating what that looks like and how we can apply it to today's situation so that we can do things like love what's not lovely. How can we defeat hate without being hateful? How can we seek justice without being unjust to one another? And so these are some of the things that we try to do in amplifying that message and keeping it relevant today based on history.
You know, Taos, I think you're absolutely right. The congressman had a saying where he would say, you know, nonviolence isn't just a tool or a tactic. It's a way of life. It's a way of living. And when you look at the through line of learning and teaching nonviolence, whether it is through American transcendental thought from the 19th century to Gandhi, to the civil rights movement and to today, the theme that John Lewis and I keep going back to is you have to teach the young people. And, you know, he had a saying, no baby is born hating another person. Hate is taught. And it should be our mission to teach love, radical love love for every person. It's the fundamental value of the beloved community.
That's right.
And in our own way, Reverend Lawson from Nashville, who was one of the early leaders of the civil rights movement in Nashville, he would lead these nonviolence workshops at Kelly Miller Smith's church. Congressman would say it was so close to the state capitol you could throw a baseball and hit the front door. And they would lead these workshops late at night. And they would bring students from all over Nashville, from Fisk, from Meharry Medical School. And he would give these nonviolence workshops. He would teach them. They would role play. They would act out the violence before they were ever allowed to go protest. And in fact, they held test sit-ins in 1959. So that by the time the Greensboro Four sat in for the first time on February 1st, 1960, they were so prepared in Nashville that they were ready to go just a week later. And in those workshops, Reverend Lawson gave them all a comic book so that they could take it with them. And that very much informed everything John Lewis and I did, and that's very much informed everything that I continue to do. One of the things I think we lose sight of is that after the signing of the Voting Rights Act, after August 6th, 1965, Watts burned. And we forget how close. It was just a few days later, in the context of that frustration, that pent-up pain that poverty leads to. And I think one of the things that the civil rights movement came up against was economic justice. That America was willing to allow equal access, but they were not willing to share their bread. They weren't willing to share their table. And once they came after fair wages, once they came after good jobs and equal access to education and equal funding for education, that was when white America retracted. And I think when we look at the modern era, we see a tremendous reckoning to that inequality, that injustice. And when we look at how we address it, I think we've got to talk about using the tools of nonviolence in ways that have concrete impact on the bottom line. Because what we saw after the movement was redlining, exclusion from the best schools, exclusion from opportunity. And if we're going to use nonviolence today, it's not so simple as, can I have a sit-in to gain access to this lunch counter? It's, how do I make sure that a black person and a white person are equally able to own that lunch counter or to make the dollar that allows them to eat at that lunch counter? And I think that's really our challenge right now.
Yeah.
To that point,
go ahead, Teo. Oh, wait.
Go ahead, Andrea.
Okay. Really, I was just thinking about not only being able, both of us are being able to own this lunch counter, but if we just think about the long-standing and long-lasting impact of what school desegregation did and how we have not reckoned with that. We have not reckoned with the dismantling of Black educators who were educated with higher terminal degrees, who were displaced. Now they are at previously all white schools and have lost all their credibility, and the generational loss of what Black educators, what the post-Brown decision did, or any other, how our school systems are still struggling with that.
And I was just going to add, Andrew mentioned two things. He mentioned love, right? And love being the core component of nonviolence. And that's something that we definitely stress at the King Center, because nonviolence, as we see it, is a love-centered way of thinking, acting, and doing that brings forth social change. And so one of the things when we talk about bringing forth an accurate representation of even the word love, Dr. King said power at its best is love, implementing the demands of justice. But a lot of times we try to separate love and separate justice as though the two don't coexist or require one another. And so part of the teachings that we do is that you have to implement the demands of justice. Love by itself is not the sentimental version that we see a lot of times, or even associate with, let's say, Valentine's Day or relationships. The love that they were talking about is a deeper, more ingrained love that requires that work. The second thing is, we mentioned the word equality. And one thing that I also want to point out is equity and the difference between the two. And so equality, if we say we're both going to equally take 5 steps together, then we equally take those 5 steps. But if I start at a disadvantaged standpoint, 20 steps behind you, then we may equally advance, but it doesn't close the gap. And so that gap still remains. And so I would also challenge us to look at the equity and the economic inequity that exists in society still today that we're going to have to reckon with, for sure.
Such great comments. And we could actually unpack this for the next 3 hours, just this one. I did want to go back to one thing that was said, because I think it's important to talk about for a moment. When we were talking about youth and millennials and sort of, the engagement. And I think, Andrew, you mentioned that, the percentage of voters was higher now than before. It's a 2-part question to anybody that wants to. It's, just asking an opinion, really, again, through your own lens. But what reason, and I have ideas, but it's not about me, but what reason do you think this engagement occurred, this increased engagement? And the second part of that is, do you think this is sustainable? Will our young people, because that's, every society needs the younger voices to engage, to come up so that, we keep moving forward. So what will it take? Do you think now we have them, So if you understand my question, that's it, 2 parts. What made the difference, and is it sustainable?
I'll speak to this from what the congressman and I discussed. We spent the last 10 years, he spent the last 10 years of his life trying to address a fundamental problem, which was that, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, most students graduated from high school only knowing 10 words about the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, I have a dream, and that's it. And John Lewis and our work together was to fix that, to bring nonviolence into America's schools. And we used a comic book to do that, and we spent years of our lives traveling and going to schools and going to colleges and universities and going to libraries and speaking with librarians. Because if you don't introduce that early and you don't make it a fundamental tenet of the core curriculum that every student is taught, then you leave it out of the American consciousness. And I think what you've seen as March is now, taught in virtually every school in America, you've seen that change. The 9-word problem doesn't exist anymore. I think now this generation that you're seeing out in the streets, they were taught nonviolence in their schools. They at least got an introduction, enough to give them an opening so that they could be curious. But I think at the same time, you're also witnessing a release of pressure from a generation that has faced more inequality financially and in an opportunity as opportunities in their own life than any before it. I mean, I hear it from my peers. I hear it from people younger than me. They grow up and they're like, boomers, man. And they're frustrated. And they've seen a whole generation go by and no progress happen. So they're using the tools and the tactics that they've now been taught in high school and in college when they get to that age. But I think the biggest problem they face, and the thing that will make the movement unsustainable if it's not addressed, is student loan debt. The way I look at the lens through which I see it is, imagine if when John Lewis had graduated from American Baptist Theological Seminary in Nashville, and he had graduated with $20 or $40 or $60,000 in student loan debt. Could he have gone on to make $10 a week as chairman of SNCC and continued his activism? No, he absolutely couldn't. And so what we've done is we've put this burden of debt on a generation that is a form of indentured servitude, so that they are not free to spend their careers being activists and student leaders, and instead are beholden to a corporate oligarchy that requires them to work simply to live and not give them the time or the space or the ability to be active citizens and to change their communities. And I think if we remove the burden of student loan debt, this is absolutely sustainable, and that this generation will bring about a new nonviolent revolution in America. But I think that's what they're afraid of, and that's why they're dragging their feet.
Fascinating. Andrea or Taos?
Sure. I do think, I agree with Andrew. I know we have been working for the past 18 years to make sure that every student in the entire state of Tennessee and beyond have a succinct curriculum beyond the Civil War to tell a certain narrative of our region. We have fought really hard to make sure that every third and fourth grader in the entire state knows who Diane Nash is, knows who Jim Bevel is. We fought really hard to change social studies standards. So I can say that there is another generation who grew up knowing about the modern civil rights movement. They also grew up understanding that there's still work to be done. We found in our work, we're asking young people daily. We had 200 students just a couple of weeks ago, of course, virtually, and I asked them, what are they willing to die for? Now, some people might think that's a tough question to ask some third graders or fourth graders, but they had a list for me of what they are willing to die for. They have deemed themselves a new generation of activists, because you're right, Andrew, they know what the civil rights movement was. They know it was more than just Dr. King, Rosa Parks. And unfortunately, sometimes I think they always throw in Frederick Douglass in the modern movement. So we debunked that, Taos. We spent a lot of time debunking that as well. But what I think will sustain them is what sustained the students in the 60s and the 40s, a student-led movement. I think them leading efforts and them being the voice, that is what will help sustain them. What I also will hinder progress possibly is the same thing that hindered us in the 50s and the 60s, and Dr. King spoke of that extreme materialism.
Fascinating, yes.
I think that's powerful. I think I'll answer the question in reverse. When we talk about what the potential threats are, Dr. King was clear about the triple evils, what he felt between racism, poverty, and give me the third one. Militarism, yes. But I think the continuance of the movement faces a couple of challenges. One, when things become highly popularized, I think it becomes challenging when the popularity wears off. After we're not seeing so much publicly in the media, after the marching has stopped, after the antics are over, and we can even look at the current administration, which will no longer exist here shortly, right? So after all this is over, the sense of urgency, I know, right? The sense of urgency, what happens next? What happens next after it's not popularized as much? And so I think that will be telling, and that will be a test to see how many people are committed to the work versus we're more so just engaging on a light level because of the popularization of it. The other thing that I think is going to be pivotal for the movement to be sustained is for leaders in some of the leadership, the legacy leadership who has been in this fight, making room for young leaders and giving people a space to exercise their voice, minimizing the differences, the generational differences that we face, and giving room for new leaders to emerge and welcoming them with the understanding that it may look different than it's looked before, but that different doesn't always imply that it's wrong. And so I think sustainability will also be contingent upon that, making room for these leaders to continue to feel as though they have a voice. The other thing is unity in messaging. And I think being able to have a concerted agenda, which I felt like was, I would say it was lacking a little bit after the social unrest we saw over the summer. It was what is the unifying or the concerted agenda moving forward that's going to usher us past this moment in history? And even with the post-election strategy, what is this message? I think as a country and as humanity, ultimately, we have to be prepared to answer three questions right now. Who must we be? What must we do? And what are we to accomplish right now? And I think that that's going to be the critical messaging and the critical questions that we have to ask, and that is now facing humanity. In terms of what I feel like was the catalyst for such large turnout in the past elections and even currently. I think a large part of it is we bridged the gap, a gap that has existed for so many years, I feel like, and especially with some of the more recent generations. And it's this gap that exists between politics and everyday life. And I think part of the messaging that was conveyed by a lot of organizations around the country was attaching the two, showing how politics directly affects your everyday life and using politics as a vehicle to affect and change in your everyday life. The other thing about that, though, is transparency. And at least in the state of Georgia, I heard a lot of conveyance of transparency. And I even use this as well in speaking to groups to let people know that voting in and of itself is not the sole solution to the challenges we face. It's just not. And so if we try to communicate that to people, then they're looking back at us like, well, you're talking about a process that has not historically worked, in at least to our view and vantage point. So why should we engage? And I think we have to be honest and continue transparency to say, hey, it's not the sole solution, but this is a critical component in our fight for justice. We have to exercise this right. And now I think we see the results of that. And how do we increase that confidence is by getting the results that a lot of people are getting right now by engaging for the first time ever. And so I think that'll also continue that momentum forward.
Excellent. Go ahead, Nick.
You're good. So continuing on the sustainability theme, one of the things that I've seen a lot in commentary lately is how problematic the momentary victories are. So, for example, President Obama's election, hugely significant, and in some ways, for some people, masked the long-term problems that didn't change at all from one day to the next, and in fact were exacerbated by his election. Can you all comment about kind of how those really important victories need to be considered, because it's so clear just with the Voting Rights Act that things get reversed or become worse very quickly, even though we might have thought we were kind of past a hurdle.
You know, just to use John Lewis as an example, well, first let me tap into Tao's point a little earlier, where he was talking about that voting is not enough, right? And after the passage of the Civil Rights Act in '64, John Lewis and Dr. King, they go to LBJ and they say, you know, thank you, but there was no voting rights component, or not a strong enough component. We need a Voting Rights Act. And LBJ says, you know, I just got you the Civil Rights Act. I passed it. Like, if you want a Voting Rights Act, you have to make me do it. And I think that's the idea that we have to have when we look at what we face right now, which is we have to make the Congress do it, right? I think that's the congressman would put it this way: we're too quiet. We have to speak up, and we have to speak out, and we have to make the Congress, and we have to make our state legislatures do it by going and meeting with them and pressuring them. And then I think to look at it in the context of your question, right? That's exactly what happened with Barack Obama. He gets elected, and then only 2 years later, they have sweeping victories in the Congress. And you know what? We didn't hold the Congress accountable, even when we had all three branches of government. And I'll give you an example. Shortly after we had unified government, one of the major initiatives that came out of the House was something called cap and trade. And I understand the theory that you wanted to follow, you wanted to go after the environment. That in an academic ivory tower world, that's where you start. But what we forgot to do was to solidify the right to vote for everyone. And had we passed the Voting Rights Act then and reauthorized it before the Republicans took Congress, before they refused to reauthorize it, and before the Shelby County decision, there would be no Donald Trump. Flat out, none. And that was a strategic error on the part of the Obama administration and on the part of Democrats in Congress. And we failed because we were looking at it from an esoteric outside point of view, from an ivory tower. And we have to look at it as, how do we solidify power? How do we give power to the disenfranchised? And then how do we give them a voice in the legislative process? And I think that's where my mind is at right now. If we do not start in January with the new Congress and the new administration with the Voting Rights Act, we will have made a mistake that we will pay a price for a long time.
I think these milestone and monumental changes, such as the Barack Obama win and administration, it's often like a pendulum effect. And so the pendulum swings way far in one direction, and it's like we forget about the opposite effect. That inevitably, if we don't interject in the process, then it's going to swing far in the opposite direction. And I think that's what we largely saw. We saw a level of complacency. I think we celebrated the Barack Obama win and victory as though we arrived, we made it. And I think we took our eye off the ball to a large degree in actually pushing forth some of the changes that were meaningful and needed. The other thing I think about when Andrew mentioned power just now is a conversation that Ambassador Andrew Young told me during the civil rights in a meeting with LBJ. And they were meeting with him, and similar to the story Andrew was saying, where he was saying, hey, I just gave you this civil rights bill. And, now you're asking about this voting rights. I don't have the power. I don't have the power to give you that right now. And so Andrew Young tells the story that Martin Luther King stood up as soon as he said that, and he said, well, thank you for your time, Mr. President. And he walked out the room. And Ambassador Young looked at Dr. King walk out the room, and he gathered his stuff quickly and followed Dr. King out. And when they got outside the White House, he asked him, he said, what was that? And he said, Dr. King looked at him, he said, well, he said he didn't have the power, so I'm going to go get him the power. And I think a lot of times we forget about the power we have as citizens. And Dr. King said, what we could not accomplish in legislative halls, we accomplished in the streets marching. And so citizens have a large part to play in, once again, holding people accountable and giving the power. When you put that creative tension out there in the atmosphere that causes attention, that dramatizes the injustice. And I think that sometimes we forget about that, or we spend a little too much time celebrating the wins and the victories, the perceived victories, without keeping our eye on what's next and how do we not only sustain the change, but how do we take it further?
I don't have anything to add to that, except, both of those were both Andrea and Teo. The only thing I would add to that is somehow I think with those celebratory moments in time and the pendulum and all those other things, that somehow we forgot that there still needs to be a radical revolution of our collective values. I think if that doesn't exist, then it doesn't matter how many victories we have at the polls on a one single symbolic vote. If we have not revolutionized how we are at our core and how we see the world and how we are responsive to transforming a better version and vision of ourselves, then we'll continue to keep having that pendulum.
If I could jump in to sort of expand upon that and then narrow it. So I love this, this collection of our values, right? How do we do that? And this was a question I was going to ask, but now I'm going to frame it a little differently. So we are in the era of misinformation. How is that achieved when there is misinformation at every corner, right? And so we're all guilty of just tuning in to hear our own echo of our own thoughts, right? We are all guilty of that reinforcement of what we choose to believe. So how do we bring about this collective, collection of our value? That wasn't really good English, but you know what I meant.
I had a friend tell me pretty much that I could answer that, a question similar to that, Renee, just simple, by logic and legislation. That's it. But it's not that simple. It's not that simple, because a collective value from one community is going to be totally different from one generation to the next. I wish I knew how we do attain that. How do we get to that place and sustain it outside of these small individual collective? And maybe the answer lies somewhere within these smaller collective values as opposed to this big universal. I don't know.
I think. Okay. No, please.
Oh, so just as maybe an example to tease this out for with Andrea. Andrea, you do a lot of work with law enforcement. How do you communicate with folks who are coming into the room with a complete opposite perspective and already resisting what you're coming there to teach them? How do you bring them into the fold? Because that's what's, I think, Renee's question is getting at.
So I would definitely lean on Dr. Ibram Kendi, and then they will never be at a place that they are part of our collective transformative values. Some people will never change, but those of us who are working together collectively, and you're correct, there are people who will join part of our programming and they say, I only see blue, I don't see any color. I mean, and Nick, you've heard me talk about how many times I've heard that in the past 5 years. And we've had statewide and local law enforcement leave the program. And because part of it was mandated, the other part was not. But that I take the Kendi approach in that's not my work. That work is for someone else. That's not my collective value. My collective value is those of us who are working together to get to that place. And so the 65 law enforcement officers that remain in the program, those are the ones that I'm going to spend my time with.
But I think.
Go ahead, Andrew.
You sure?
Yeah,
right.
Go for it.
I think there's a way in which we signal our values, right? We talked earlier about curriculum. That's one way in which we signal our values, right? For the most part, young people are taught Western ideas, and they're not exposed to the world. And then we're surprised when they're afraid of immigrants, right? I think another example in which we signal our values, which has been really meaningful to see reversed in some respects, are the monuments that we put up, the statues, the ways in which we memorialize our past. I think when you go to the Georgia General Assembly and you see a Confederate statue there and you're 8 years old, that tells you that's okay. That tells you that is a person to emulate. But now, if you go where there was once former Senator Craig statue on the grounds of the Georgia General Assembly, who, just to make a fine point of this, Craig was a senator who was vehemently opposed to war, but he was also a Klansman. And when Dr. King marched for the seating of Julian Bond, who was kicked out of the General Assembly for sharing that exact same opinion, Dr. King stood in the shadow of that statue and preached. And it was that value signaling, again, with the symbolism and the imagery, and those things stick with people. And I totally agree with Andrea, like, there are lost souls. There are some people whose souls are too hard to change. But that doesn't mean we ever stop trying. That doesn't mean we stop trying to reach the young people and show them a better way. I think that was a lesson John Lewis taught me. That's what I've dedicated my life to, whether it's, I even made Captain America go to the civil rights movement and confront the fact that you can't punch racism. And that's it, right? We show our values through our stories, through what we aspire to be, through our statues and our symbols and our mythology as a people. And I think we have to change that as much if we're going to change people's hearts and minds.
To that point, I also think that we give them a realistic vision. We paint vision that, part of they talk about low turnout in some political races being a result of an inability of citizens to see themselves in the future painted by either candidate. And I think we have to give people a realistic vision. And for us, that vision is the beloved community, where we're not asking for sameness. We're not asking for everybody to be the same. We want to celebrate all the differences that everybody brings to the table. But at the same time, there are certain values, and we want to make sure that everybody recognizes both the dignity and humanity of every person at the table, and that they all feel as though they have a space. In addition to that, real quickly, Dr. King, when we talk about, there may be some people that will never agree, right? So Dr. King, one of the practices that he had was he sought out to understand the opposition to the point where he could advocate on behalf of the opposition. That's how well he studied and educated himself on their position, number one. And I think that's a step that a lot of times most of us don't take in an act, seeking to understand the opposition so well that we can articulate their vantage point. And then, number two, and this one might not be as popular as well, but Dr. King would not throw away those individuals. The individuals that don't agree with us or cancel culture, Dr. King, the danger is what happens when you cancel an individual that's still living and walking this earth. Mm-hmm. Then what do? Dr. King sought to win friendships over enemies. He sought to attack and defeat injustice and not people. And so a lot of times, you know, from his philosophy, we don't believe in throwing away anybody because we believe that everybody can contribute. And we have a saying that, you know, everyone matters, everyone deserves respect, and everyone can make a difference. And so the challenge really becomes how do we not throw people away, but how do we seek to win friendships, even when it's hard and difficult to do. But that's the power of love, and the reason why love has to show up in the difficult places. And so those are just two thoughts.
That's beautiful. And actually, it leads me to the next round of questions, which will probably be our last because we have questions that are coming in. I had so many I wanted to ask, so you may have to all come back. So it kind of dovetails with what you're saying, Taos. So we're hearing, you know, over the last 2 days, this call for unity and healing, right? Not making it political, but calling for unity and healing. How does one do that effectively? Or maybe the question really is, what is needed to effectively move forward?
Okay.
Yes, I saw you.
Look, I feel really strongly about what happened. Those were offices I worked in. Those were my friends and my colleagues that hid under desks and hid behind doors and put their lives on when you're a congressional staffer, you always face some danger. But that was to say now, after egging those people on, after encouraging and fomenting such unbelievable behavior, sedition. It is sedition. Unity is not the answer. Forgiveness is not the answer. Consequences are the answer. We are a nation of laws. And when you try and undermine the very existence of the nation, you should face consequences. And in this context, the way in which they're going about it, they sound like a domestic abuser to me. They sound like somebody who's saying, "Don't make me hit you again, Laureen." Like, that's what it sounds like. And these are the people who would do that. I bet if you went and looked at the Republican members of Congress and actually did a deep dive, you'd find there were some domestic abuse charges in their past. And I think when they come to us and they ask for forgiveness now, that they be forgiven for fomenting this, for putting people's lives on the line, there is no room. There is only consequence. And I say this in the context of nonviolence, because the key tenet of nonviolence is accepting the consequences of your actions. And just like Dr. King sat in jails throughout the South as a consequence of his disobedience, so too must the organizers and the leaders and the rank and file members and the participants of this action must sit in jail and suffer the consequences.
But does unity flow at some point?
It can, so long as the consequences are sufficient. I think if you're going to have unity, it's going to be because people atoned for their sin. Whether you're in the church or you're in the court of law, you still have to atone. And these people have shown no contrition. They have not apologized. They have not come out and said, "We did something wrong." So there is no unity until you admit that you did something wrong and you suffer the consequences.
So the path forward is consequences, acknowledging acceptance, consequences, and then. Yes. All right. Andrea or Taos, through your lens.
You want to go first, Andrea, or you want me to go?
You go, because I'm still thinking, I think I just came out of the box and said, those aren't my people. So I'm still thinking, Renee, like, how do we move forward? How do we do this? And how do we galvanize that? So if I had to go now, I think I would say everything that Andrew lists is prerequisites of what people are to do: the internal work, the social work, the legal work, the social consequences, and the legal consequences that should be paid. I think in order for us to move forward as well, we have to recognize the seriousness of the imbalance of power and what led us up to this point. So it's really hard for me to figure out and say, how do we move forward? Because I don't think we've done a good job as to grappling with and being honest with ourselves. You all talked earlier about the transparency and being totally transparent in who we are as a nation, that what led up to this. And so I think until we dissect that, the generations, I think Charles Blow said it better than I have heard in a long time in his PBS, what he said on Sunday morning about the idea of the seriousness in the threat of power, particularly white power as it relates to supremacy. And anytime there is a threat to white power, then we will always have terror because it would not have worked out the way they wanted to in the ballot. So until we address that as a nation, I don't know how we get to the point of moving forward collectively. I think we do it. We've seen it individually in communities, in neighborhoods, and in states. We've seen it in institutions. We've seen it in the arts. We've seen it in, a new generation, the young man, Jerome Foster, I think in DC, who's, taking on this charge. And his whole goal is to start not just one new civil rights movement, but 5 new civil rights movements so that every youth will have his or their own place in those social movements. So we're seeing it. But the larger universal love, I think we have to still do some eradicating. And it goes kind of what Andrew said, that list must be done before we get to that place.
Thank you. Yeah. Taos, because I piggybacked off of something that you raised. So, yeah.
Sure. So, like I said earlier, love has to show up in the hard places. First of all, what happened at the Capitol was completely unacceptable, point blank, period. There's a statement that is often chanted at a lot of the rallies and marches, and even over the summer, participating in a lot of those demonstrations, and it's no justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. And we have to look at the two words in relationship, because for Dr. King, at least, peace was more than just the absence of violence. Peace was reconnecting the disconnected parts of society in a harmonious whole. And so what this showed was how privilege and how a lot of the systemic and structural issues that have really embedded themselves in the framework of our country are exposed, heightened, and emboldened to such a degree that now we're seeing it erupt and spill over into these types of incidences. And so the other thing that we have to take into account is nonviolence is a way of thinking. And so we teach nonviolence to change how people engage from a mental standpoint. But how they behave, nonviolence does not regulate lawlessness. And so that's where the law steps into place. And them being prosecuted to the full extent of the law based on their actions and behaviors, because there are consequences for the actions you take. Our goal through nonviolence is to change how they think, but how they act, then that's the very reason why we have the law in place. The law cannot necessarily take the hate out of somebody. Nonviolence can change the way they think and drive the hate out. But if somebody acts in a hateful manner, then the place of the law is to come in now and to serve justice. And so I think that's how we contextualize the incident that happened.
Excellent. Nick, I'm going to throw it back to you.
So unfortunately, we are out of time, but I think the audience questions that we received have been kind of addressed in the last few responses there. One of the things that I'd love to just throw out before we invite Kyla back on, in kind of one of the signals of how problematic all of this has been in the last days and years, and then relating it back to Dr. King, is the image of Reverend Warnock when he was arrested for protesting peacefully within the Capitol, and then people actually being allowed to assault Capitol police officers in the fulfillment of their duty within the building. And that contrast is what Andrea was talking about in terms of the white supremacy power issue that is there and is going to continue to get worse. And like, for those who might be watching us from out of the DC area, if you've never lived here, we are literally in a state of terror in this entire metropolitan region right now. Our friends and loved ones work in DC. We have people at the library whose siblings are Capitol Police officers. This is very real for us. This is a direct attack on our existence and daily life. And it might not feel like that in the far stretches of the country, though I'm sure some of you are getting it because of the symbolism of what's been going on, but this is not sustainable. And I think the nonviolence movement is a way for us to kind of work forward in a way that is constructive and that acknowledges that there is no one moment that is going to fix all of this, that this is a continuum and it is a cycle. And every time we have forward movement, we know that there's going to be worse behind it, so that we have to prepare ourselves for that. And this is, again, this is human rights, this is civil rights, this is not a partisan issue, though there are very partisan elements to all this that need to be discussed. But just with our role as the library, just want to highlight the fact that this is really all about all of us coexisting peacefully in harmony and respecting each other's own perspectives and such. So with that, I'm going to invite Kyla back, and thank you for the little moment to editorialize.
All right, thank you. Thank you, all of you, for that amazing conversation. You three panelists were absolutely genius. I have to echo Renee and say we need to have you all back, because we could keep talking, and I want to keep talking for hours. And thank you also, of course, to Renee and Nick for moderating. You did a great job. And I need to thank, as always, Prince George's County Memorial Library System for their ongoing partnership in bringing great events like this to the residents of our county, state, and country. And I see that we also have Canada on YouTube watching, so our continent, really. And I also like to give particular thanks to this evening to Maryland Humanities for their support in bringing this event. To our viewers, thank you for being with us. You're really faithful about tuning in, and we love that we can bring this programming to you. I want to let you know that you can get Andrew's books through the library and also through the Comics Plus app as digital books. We have some other great events I want you to know about. Tomorrow night, we're talking to Ellen Ann Fentress, a DC crime novelist, Neely Tucker, about the legacy of segregation academies in the South and the lingering impact of white supremacy. On January 19th, we welcome Kate Anderson Brower for an Inauguration Eve special event. And on January 21st at 4 p.m., we are debuting our young adult book group, where we're going to talk about Leigh Bardugo's blockbuster novel, Six of Crows. So you can learn about these and other events by going to pgcmls.info/events. And I encourage you to follow us on Twitter, our agency at HRC-PG County, and the library across all social media platforms at PGC-MLS. So once again, thank you to all of our guests, because that was really just an amazing conversation, and to all of you for tuning in. Thank you so much.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.